Thanks, Chris. Good morning. I'd like you to imagine a scientist. What are you imaging right now? What do they look like? What do they wear? Where are they working? What is the image that you see of a scientist? This is a very important exercise. Because most of us imagine someone that looks like this. In fact, the repetition of the items that we describe are so common, whether it's children or adults, over time, that there's in fact even an inventory for how we think of a scientist. We think of things like a lab coat, they have big hair, they have glasses, they work in a laboratory with beakers with green fluid bubbling over. But this is an incorrect stereotype, because in fact, a scientist looks like me and it looks like you. See, scientific thinking is the most important mechanism that we have for understanding the truth, which is more critical than ever in an era of post-truth, where it's difficult to tell fiction from fact, myth from reality. We need to be able to embrace scientific thinking because it gives us an incredibly rich body of knowledge and a methodology to be able to tell truth from lie. So, my goal today, I have 3 things that I would like to teach you. First of all, I want to help you embrace scientific thinking. I want you to feel comfortable saying, I'm a scientific thinker, and I want you to have those expectations for yourself and for others. That's why we're going to start with this incredibly important goal. The second part of our talk today will be to make sure we all understand what behavioral economics is. It gives us a powerful new set of insights to understand our customers and to be able to improve our businesses with this strategy. And then our third goal is for me to give you some concrete steps to bring behavioral economics to life inside your organization. Let's get started. So we all have the potential for scientific thinking within us. But why does it feel so uncomfortable? Why do we have this stereotypical image of what a scientist looks like? One of the challenges is that our exposure to the language of science only happens when we're in 8th grade, maybe in our biology class, and we're exposed to the critical words that are essential to scientific thinking. Words like intuition versus evidence, having a hypothesis, running experiments as a way to test our beliefs. That language is not used in today's contemporary society. We're not asking our colleagues critical questions like, how do you know? How do you know? How often do you ask the question, how do you know? How well do you judge the quality of evidence that you are being presented with? These are the critical elements of scientific thinking. We have the potential for scientific thinking within us, though. And what I'd like to do right now is I'm going to take us through an example that will help us first see where we already have some of the essential skills within us for scientific thinking, and then I'm going to take us further. So let's go through this process of recognizing the scientific thinker within us by going to the grocery store. How many times have you stood in line and felt that you were in the slowest line? And watch my body language. We do this, right? We're studying the other line. Maybe we have a marker. We take somebody and we count how far back are we, how fast are they going. We start to look at things like maybe it's the customer, and they got all this produce. It always takes so long for the produce. Or they've got a full cart in your line. Or maybe what we see is that the store they don't have enough lanes. Or maybe it's the cashier. Maybe we see that they're not moving very quickly. Okay, so let's now think about this everyday scenario. And now I want us to deconstruct the elements of that process that were scientific thinking. These are the things we did. And it's important for us to identify them so that we can improve the discipline that we have as we undergo each of these stages. So first of all, was that process of gathering those observations, trying to make empirical observations out of what we were seeing. The second thing was trying to theorize about the root cause analysis. What was making this particular line so slow? And third, maybe we start to hypothesize about what might make this better. Is it training the cashiers? Is it introducing more lanes? What might make the overall experience faster? Okay, so you say, okay, I do those things. I recognize those skills within me. But now I'm going to do a gotcha. Now I want to build and have you challenge the scientific thinking that you already have by let's going a little bit further. Because as leaders, it's critical for us to have the best tools, the best knowledge that we possibly can to ensure that we're delivering the ultimate value to our customers. So, here's where we need to dig deeper. You see, scientists spend as much energy trying to prove themselves wrong in every way, the different observations that we have, the different hypotheses that we have about what might solve the problem, as the actual observations themselves, proving ourselves wrong. So one of the things that we do is we'll look to what is the prior literature on this particular challenge? What is the prior literature on standing in lines? I invite you to do what I did, which was to study this problem of standing in lines merely by accessing publicly available resources through scholar.google.com. And here I found an entire body of scientific literature on standing in lines. And I learned things like the perception of standing in the line is one of the challenges that will not be solved by operational solutions. Even if we make the line faster, we will still always end up, with my luck, being in the slowest line. So that process of standing in a line, the challenge is that it's a relative perception. Other things that scientific research have found is that our perception of how long a line will take is generally very, very wrong. We see a line and we think that line is going to take forever, when in fact it might actually only take a couple of minutes. But even more interesting, scientific research has analyzed the question of how long people thought they stood in the line, and it turns out that we round up these numbers very significantly. So if we actually stood in a line for 3 minutes, people will tend to estimate that that line took sometimes as long as 10 minutes. And that's how far off our estimate is on how long we stood in a line. So we have several things now that are actually about perception than they are about true operational issues. So a solution then that tackles making the line actually faster won't address the perception of the line being slower. Solutions that we could find in the literature would be things like having a sign that says, from this point, the line typically takes 5 minutes. Let us know if it took longer today. Now think about the cost of that solution versus increasing the number of lanes, changing the training that we have for that cashier, changing the technology that we're using for the checkout counters. So our intuition then, in terms of what might work as a solution, might misguide us, either solutions that are more costly than necessary or that might not be effective. So much of that information then was derived from what was already publicly available, and we call that standing on the shoulders of giants. This isn't a talk about standing in lines, don't worry. It's a talk about understanding that there's this incredible body of knowledge that you can, whatever challenge you're working on, it's best to go and look there to see what has already been developed. Another way I like to put this for business audience is that there's this entire school of intellectual property waiting for your application for the challenges that you're working on. Okay, let's review. The fundamental building blocks for scientific thinking then are the ones that we already naturally do, but here's the new set that we need to challenge ourselves with. It is this humility to recognize that we might be wrong when we're interpreting that problem. It's this looking to the prior research and standing on the shoulders of giants. In fact, I didn't mention this, but there's a professor who goes by the name Dr. Q, because all he does is study around the world the phenomena of people standing in lines. So think about how much we can learn from him. And then last but not least, the power of scientific thinking comes from testing our hypotheses. Okay, now that we have this foundation of scientific thinking in place, we can now move on to behavioral economics, which is an exciting new world of understanding how people make decisions. But we need to have that foundation of scientific thinking in place to help us understand the fact that we're actually all in the business of behavior change. All of us, everyone in this room is a behavioral architect, whether we're marketing to increase awareness, to increase the number of people buying things, we're trying to impact their behavior one way or another. So we're all in the business of behavioral change. We're all practitioners of behavioral science, but perhaps we just haven't been intentional about it. We haven't had the science to ground our insights. So we're going to do this right now. We're going to cover a couple of the foundational elements that define behavioral economics. These are the key theories of behavioral economics. So if you know that, you've got a solid foundation for understanding what behavioral economics is. Then we'll go into some examples. So the first theory for us to understand is bounded rationality. And a Nobel Prize was won for this concept. And basically what it means is that it's not that we're not good, reasoning, logical people. We have that capability. We've launched rockets to the moon and into space. So clearly we have an incredible ability as a human species. So bounded rationality then is for us to understand what happens when we're not being robust in our decision making. You see, it's simply like this. We don't always have all of the time that we need in order to make a robust decision. We don't necessarily have access to all of the information that we need. Or sometimes we don't have the willpower, even after we've made the decision that this is what we ought to do. Sometimes there's a gap between what we actually do. These elements are the foundation of our bounded rationality. So then another key component of the theory of behavioral economics then is to understand these terms heuristics and biases. So heuristics then are what we use when we're not using a spreadsheet to help us make our decision. Heuristics are what we do when we're sort of looking for cues in the environment, like, well, what are other people doing? That sometimes is very good information to help us make a decision. Or what do we think the experts are saying? That becomes another reliable way to help us make a decision. So these are shortcuts. So instead of us doing the full analysis, sometimes we use these shortcuts to help us make a decision. And those are often very reasonable. But the challenge that we face is that sometimes we're vulnerable to bias when we're following those shortcuts. Maybe the social proof that we're looking to is misguided. Maybe what we perceive to be an expert isn't actually an expert. And so this is where we sometimes make decisions that would be considered suboptimal. Okay. So one more thing about behavioral economics for us to know in terms of the theory. If you go to look at the Wikipedia for biases, what you're going to find will be overwhelming. There's over 350 of these biases when I last looked. What that tells us is this is a huge and growing field. There's so much that we're learning about how we're making decisions and in different contexts. So this becomes a very exciting time for us working in the real world to learn about these biases, to understand our customers' behavior better, and to then start to develop the strategies and tactics that actually get at the root of those biases. I want us to look at one of the most common examples in behavioral economics. And this is the example. What we're looking at right now is a data set about people's participation in organ donation. Now, if you ask people, surveys in most countries around the world would say people think that this is an incredibly important thing to do. But here we see a very big difference in the participation rates. Across the bottom, we have the countries, different levels of participation in organ donation. So we see one group with the purple bars are very low participation countries. So what could we say then about Germany, perhaps, relative to the neighboring country, Austria? Could we say that there's something fundamentally different about Austrians versus Germans that might explain their difference in participation? We could look at a few other pairs in this data. On the outside, we have Denmark versus Sweden. Denmark's participation is very low and Sweden's is very high. Can we say that the people from Denmark are much nicer than the people from Sweden? That wouldn't be a fair and accurate assessment of the culture. So if it isn't a cultural difference or a demographic difference, then what explains the difference in participation? It's simply the fact that when people enroll in organ donation, in one set of countries, the default option on the form that doesn't require you to check a box, in one set of countries it's defaulted to an opt-in, and in another set of countries it's defaulted to opt-out. All it takes is the design of a form to have this huge sway on people's behavior. Why? The bias here is status quo bias. We tend to just go with the flow. Even something as simple as picking up a pen is an act of intentionality that requires us to go against the grain, to go against the default. And so defaults have an incredibly powerful impact on people's behavior, even with something as personally important as one's belief and commitment to organ donation. Okay. Now, the power of behavioral economics is about leveraging our biases to help people make good decisions. So now that we've looked at the organ donation example, I want us to now apply those insights to another challenge. So in this case, what we're looking at is retirement savings. Now, we all know that we should be actively saving for our retirement. Many companies set up programs for us where we can put our salary into the retirement savings program, and that portion of the salary is exempt from tax. Some companies even match what the employee puts in. But here's the thing. The line on the bottom, the dark line, indicates how long it takes for employees of their own volition to actually enroll in the retirement savings program. What this shows us is it takes about 5 years to finally reach a majority, or 1 in 2, enrolling in the retirement savings program. Now, let's take the perspective for a moment of an employee enrolling in these programs. Retirement savings, ugh, what a boring topic. Think about how difficult it is, like, what percentage should I be saving? What should I be investing in? These are very complicated decisions for most people. So what do we do when we are confronted with difficult decisions? We tend to procrastinate. We tend to procrastinate. So if we know that people tend to procrastinate when they're confronted with difficult decisions, and yet this is something that is incredibly important for people's long-term financial well-being, then what can we do to help people into retirement savings programs? Well, I've already given you one strategy, And that's the strategy that was tested here. And that is to, in fact, default employees into a retirement savings program. Actually, to put them in. Now, give them the option to opt out, but to default them into the program. And we see that most employees, when they're defaulted into a retirement savings program, 75 to 95% of employees will stay in that program. But here's the thing. Some challenges about this. Companies typically choose a low amount, like 3%. But if we've defaulted people in, now they've got their own status quo bias keeping them in at that 3%. We should all be saving at least around 10% per year. So now if we're defaulting people in at a rate like 3%, we now have set them up for continuing what is a suboptimal amount. So that's a negative consequence of default. Or another thing is we might be putting people into an investment choice that isn't aggressive enough, maybe based on their age, or maybe they ought to be putting their money into paying off any high interest debt that they have at this time. So this is one of the consequences of behavioral economics that makes it controversial. So we need to think about this in terms of a caution. So just because we can impact people doesn't necessarily mean we should. Now, in the case of retirement savings, we're making a choice that is beneficial to most people, and we're not taking away their right to choose a better option for them. But there have also been cases of companies using behavioral economics in inappropriate ways. In fact, there was a cable company in Canada that had adjusted their cable packages. They had new channels, and so they created new bundles. The thing is, these bundles were at a different price point, and what they did was they defaulted people into the higher price bundles. We can now say, oh, how terrible. Their thinking was that this would be convenient for customers, but in fact, it was actually more beneficial to the company. So when we're thinking about using behavioral economics, the question that we need to ensure that we're aligning our choices to is, are we making a decision that's in the best interest of the person, or are we making a decision that's in the best interest of the company? Okay, so behavioral economics offers us three things. This was what was so powerful for me when I first got exposed to behavioral economics and my role in strategy and innovation. I felt, wow, this is a tool set like none I've ever seen before. Because first of all, it gives us these insights on these biases that are much richer, much deeper than what I was able to get from customer surveys and focus groups, because customers don't do a very good job sometimes of articulating their preferences and their needs. So behavioral economics gives us this much richer insight on human decision making. And then the second thing that's incredible is it gives us this whole new set of tools to impact and influence behavior, such as the role of defaults. And thirdly, what behavioral economics offers us is this framework for experimentation that will allow us to be more innovative, to take more risk. So, now that we've gone through the foundation of what behavioral economics is, let's go through an example of behavioral economics in action. Now, I want us to imagine that we're working together on the challenge of how we're going to increase people's savings. And what are the tools that we can think about? Now, one thing that we can do is, there we go. One thing we can do is maybe test the hypothesis that if we give people information, regular reminders, this will increase their likelihood to save. That's a hypothesis. And so let's test this hypothesis. Now, this is a field experiment that was run with over 3,000 people. And so one of the things that was tested was giving people weekly reminders. And in that reminder, it said, please don't forget to save for your future this week. And it also had their amount in the account. And so they received this text message every week. So if we think that these kinds of reminders might be effective, here's another idea that was tried. This idea was customized so that the text messages were designed as if they came from the children. So it said, hi, Mommy, don't forget to save for our future this week. Love, and my daughter's name is Taylor. So imagine receiving that message every week with your balance. Now, let's think about another hypothesis. Another hypothesis is, let's give people an incentive. That will increase the likelihood of saving. So, let's think about a couple ways that we can design this experiment. One of the ways is, let's experiment with giving people a 10% match. Now, there is a cap, but still, it's a generous amount, 10%. So we'll giving people a 10% match increase their likelihood to save. Okay, that's one hypothesis. Now, the second variation on that is, let's give them 20%. Now, some of you might be thinking, that's awfully expensive for us to do. But what I want you to remember is we're only in an experiment right now. And one of the beauties of experimentation is sometimes if you have a hypothesis, you can take one of the conditions and actually just go really extreme with it, just to see, just to make sure, if we think it's going to work, what happens if we double it? Do we get double the benefit? Do we get more? Do we get less? Because then we can kind of move and have a deeper understanding of the impact of that. And so this generous 20% offer was one of the conditions that was tested. Now, there's two ways that we can reward people. One is at the end of the week. So if they've saved that week, then we will give them the match at the end of the week. Another way we can do this is instead to give them the money at the beginning of the week using a powerful concept called loss aversion. And the way this worked in this experiment is that this money was put into an escrow account, but it looked like it was actually sitting in their account. So when they looked at the balance, they had this incentive plus what they had saved already in the account. But if they hadn't saved by the end of the week, the money was taken out of the account. And they were reminded, don't forget to save this week, or we will take away this incentive. Now, a last condition that was tested was this use of a golden coin. It's about the size of a poker chip. And this experiment was run over a period of 24 weeks. And people were encouraged to scratch off the number of the week it was in the program if they saved that week. And if they didn't save that week, don't scratch off the number that you see on the perimeter of the coin. They were also instructed to keep it in a visible place. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you, which of these conditions do you think had the highest impact on people's savings? So let me put them back up so we can look at them. Remember, we had the weekly text reminder. We had the weekly text reminder from children. So could I ask you to raise your hands so that we can all see what your choice is? And only vote once. Only vote once. These are the conditions. So let me put them up for us to look at together. Weekly text reminder with the balance. Do you think that was the most effective? We have a few. Weekly text reminder from the children. We have a lot. How about those who think that the 10% as the reward condition? We have a few. 10% at the beginning of the week with the loss aversion condition. We have a few. Okay, now the 20%. Let's do the 20% with the loss aversion condition. Many. And we have the 20% as the reward condition, the end of the week. And then last but not least, the coin with the scratch-off numbers. Okay, there's a couple. So one of the things that's incredibly important for us to do is when we have a hypothesis, to make a prediction in advance, and to even articulate why, to understand why we chose what we did, to do that in advance so that we don't expose ourselves to post hoc rationalization. Because we can always explain things after the fact. We can always come up with a reason after. So we need to make our prediction, we need to be public about it, we need to declare the impact that we think it will have. And this will help us to improve our intuition. But the other thing that's incredibly beautiful about experimentation is this. We didn't have consensus in this room. And imagine how long it might take this room in Bogota to reach consensus. It might take a very long time. So how would we make the decision? How would we choose what to do? Now, many people thought the text from the children versus the 20% condition would work. I've presented this experiment many times, and those are the two that people vote on the most. It's predictable. But here's the thing. Here's the actual performance of these different conditions in the real world with 3,000 people. And we see that the couple of people that voted for the gold coin, your intuition was correct. In fact, that did have the greatest likelihood of increasing people's savings rate. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. I know some of you who especially thought the 20% loss aversion condition would have the highest impact. That seems very reasonable, doesn't it? The other one would be the text message from the children. None outperformed the coin. The hypothesis about the coin is that money has become so abstract to us, savings is so abstract, and saving for our long term feels so distant that we don't have any immediate joy and gratification out of it. So combining the tangibility of the coin with this immediate gratification of seeing your savings grow, those are the hypotheses that underlie why we think the gold coin works. But you'll notice there were a couple of other conditions in this experiment, which was also to associate the incentive element with it. Now, it surprised us. It didn't work as well as the coin alone. We thought that if we had the coin plus these conditions, we would have something that was an even greater effect. But this is the beauty of experimentation, is letting us find things that we even find surprising and counterintuitive. Let's step back and talk about the challenge of innovation. There was a survey of senior executives asking them how they felt about their team's ability to be innovative. And the results are very disappointing. We don't have much confidence in our teams to be innovative. But the barrier is a behavioral one. Just telling people to be innovative doesn't give them the guidance, doesn't give them the support that they need to actually be innovative. In fact, we had an interesting experience working with a bank, and I had the opportunity to have dinner with the CEO of this bank. And we talked about a project that we had been working on, helping improve the collections for the credit card division. And one of the ideas that we had proposed came from that scientific literature that I encouraged you guys to explore. We saw that if people have bills on color paper, then people are more likely to pay their late bills if those bills are on color paper. The underlying research suggests that it increases the attention to the bill. When people open the envelope, they're more surprised. It gets that attention. And so their likelihood to prioritize that bill goes up. Their attention to that bill increases. And so we thought, well, this would be fantastic. This is our client. We have some prior research. Let's run an experiment and see if it works here. So we went to the head of the bill collections team, and we said, we'd like to try colored paper. And he said, oh, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. I said, well, why not? He says, well, if you want to run this experiment, you have to know that color paper costs 3 cents more per sheet than white paper does. We said, well, we're just going to run an experiment. We estimate the cost to be about $500 to run this experiment. And he said, no, there's absolutely no way that I could support us running this experiment because we know that color paper costs more. He was missing the relationship between running an experiment and learning. We just want to learn, what is the ROI? Does the color paper have an impact on people's credit performance? Does it help the customer make better decisions and pay their bills on time or not? We can look at the ROI as a result of the experiment. but he did not have the mindset to understand the role of experimentation and helping try new ideas. So when I shared this story with the CEO, she literally banged her head on the table, and she asked the question. She said, I don't understand why my people would make a decision like that. It's not as if we're at a point in time in our business where we're very focused on the bottom line. We're not in a cycle right now where we have to worry about every penny. We're actually in a really good place, and I'm encouraging people to be creative. And what I told her was that innovation is an outcome. It's an outcome of a process that we can unleash people's ability to try new ideas if they understand the role of experimentation. They're given license to be curious and try new ideas, that they can spend that extra money to run an experiment that might work, that might fail, but will still contribute to the organizational learnings. So let's now look at different types of innovation. So the coin might be considered radical innovation. That, the use of that coin is not something that any of us would predict would be effective, especially relative to approaches like giving people regular incentives, giving people regular information. And so that was an out-of-the-box idea. Let's go through some other kinds of examples of the role that behavioral insights and the scientific method can play in helping you unlock innovation. Now, this is a case study that I'm very excited to share with you. We worked with a very large beer company, and they had a challenge in front of them of dealing with their bottles and cans that their beverage is distributed in. And there's a couple of challenges with bottles and cans. They're not a very efficient means to distribute liquid, because of the shape. And then the other challenge with them is the waste. Even with recycling, there's still waste. There's a huge cost, not just to the company, but also to municipalities. And so there was great pressure for the company around the world to start to develop other ways that people can buy their beer. And so the CEO started to think about, how can we get people to buy beer in kegs instead of buying in bottles and cans? What could drive that kind of a change in behavior and a change in consumption and a change in how we buy? And so the hypothesis was, we can maybe get people to buy in these plastic containers, but they're biodegradable, and they crush, so they use less space, and they have less weight. But how do we make that appealing? And so the idea was, make it draft. Make the beer draft, so it has that extra appeal. So how do we know that this product will work? How can we measure the consumer likelihood to purchase this product? So the company went through a number of focus groups, and I got to watch the videos of this research. It was fun. You see, customers were given a prototype of the machine, and they were drinking the beer, and the camera was rolling, and then the surveyor was asking lots of questions, and they were still drinking the beer. And as they drank the beer, the customer got happier and happier about their likelihood to actually purchase this machine. And even the price that they would be willing to pay for the machine kept going up as they sampled the product. I'm not so sure that the guidance that came from that was as useful as the company needed. And in fact, the first product that they launched, they made millions of the machines. They're stacked up in a warehouse right now. They failed. But the fundamental idea and the fundamental challenge seems sound. So what can we change about the product, its position, its design, and even its pricing to help lead to better acquisition? And then ultimately, how do we have a way to measure the likelihood of purchasing the product that is reliable, that the company can count on as reliable insight for forecasting the demand on a product? So we designed a field experiment that went like this. We had a prototype of the new machine. We'd done a bunch of research and testing on creating different value propositions, and then we designed 2 new packages for those value propositions. We developed 2 price points for the new machine. And then we worked with 16 stores that sell beer, and we packaged these machines up in a giant display, and we had the prototype right there for customers to see. And then inside each box, we had a bag of sand that weighed exactly what the machine would weigh. And then what we did was we observed. First, we observed overall store traffic, which we had the data for. We observed the number of people approaching the display. And then here's the most important part for you who are interested in developing a reliable forecast method. We counted the number of customers who picked up the box, went to the cashier, waited in line, and tried to buy the machine. Now here we intercepted them because there was nothing in it. The machine was still only a prototype. But what we did was we then intercepted and we gave them coupons and we apologized and we said, this product doesn't actually exist yet, but may we ask you some questions about why you wanted to buy the product and who the product was for and how you intend to use the product. But that data, every time someone went to the cash register, gave us true purchase data. And so now what we had was, across our 16 stores, we had combined those different packages, the different prices, with the product as a way to look at the impact across different combinations. And we could see what the product uptake was. And in fact, if we had only gone out with one variation, we would miss potentially seeing the high end and the low end of what those actual purchase attempts would be. So one of the takeaways from this is to see how you can actually measure behavior in the real world using a variety of approaches. Now let's look at another challenge. How might we increase classroom attendance using behavioral insights amongst adult learners? And I want you to see the process that we would use to solve this challenge. So when we look to the behavioral research, we find that we have biases, like, even as adults, things like a barrier would be a lack of social support. As an adult learner, you don't necessarily have a group of kids who you're still going to school with. You're on your own as a learner. Another barrier would be our confidence in learning new things. It's hard to know little and to be confronted with having to learn new things. Another barrier would be just having a lack of positive encouragement and feedback to encourage our learning. Other challenges would be, the opportunity cost that adult learners face, and then also planning problems, especially when we're juggling many things. So these would be some of the biases that we need to now recognize are barriers to people showing up for class. Okay, so some of the hypotheses that we had then were, let's actually test just giving people a nudge on Sunday night before class starts. This was a very low-cost experiment. We just wanted to see if we sent people a nudge on Sunday night, a text message nudge, that used language that addressed those biases. So in one set of communications, we tested using this very positive language, like, you have a social community, we've got you, we look forward to seeing you. Another thing that we tested was implementation intentions, encouraging people to actually plan and to declare how many classes they were going to attend that week. Now, there's variations of the content that we tested, but ultimately what we were doing was running an experiment that looked at the effectiveness of sending these nudges out in one variation of the experiment through text and another variation through email, to see what the impact is. And we tested it on nearly 700 students. And we did this over a period of 11 weeks. But here's the thing. So when we were working with the CEO of this school on this experiment, some of the operators of the campuses totally disagreed with this project. They thought the communications would become annoying to the students, at worst. At best, it would have no effect at all. It wasn't worth doing anything. In fact, everything had been tried. Nothing at all has worked to increase people's attendance. It just is what it is. People are going to, attend class the way that they attend class, and nothing's actually going to encourage their attendance, which is a very disappointing starting place. But again, this is the power of running a small experiment. The company didn't have the infrastructure already in place to do these regular communications. And so we built a very crude way of sending the emails and the text messages out of a spreadsheet, basically, is how we built it. And then we had someone manually sending the messages in one of these two conditions. We just want to see what works. We're just curious, could we get any impact at all from sending this little note on a Sunday night? And it turns out that we did. It turns out that we were able to increase over the control the people's likelihood to attend class by 4.5% to 7% based on either the text condition or the email condition. The thing is, this is a very simple experiment and had an impact on people's likelihood to attend class. Now, the data shows from this experiment that we just finished that we still get this kind of a drop-off, and then you see the little surge at the end. So I have all kinds of questions about what might we do kind of in that middle point. And I imagine you probably have lots of hypotheses as well about what we might do to help now curb this trend. But this is data that they didn't have before. This is an impact that they didn't have before. These are channels that they didn't even test before. Think about how much fun my team is going to have going forward and continuing to work on nudging in-class attendance rates. So what I want you to understand is that behavioral science offers us a framework to operationalize innovation. So this third part is, I want to show you the method that we've developed over the last 10 years to bring behavioral economics to life inside of organizations. These are the steps that we suggest you follow. Now, across the bar at the top, you see where it says from research to implementation. And I've talked about that. This is the research encompasses understanding the biases. Strategy gives us new tactics to try, and then implementation through experiments. So that's this beauty of behavioral economics, and also the challenge, perhaps, for your organizations. You might have folks who are in the research team that are disconnected maybe from the different P&L groups, disconnected from operations. Behavioral economics gives you a way to actually bring those teams together. Let's go through the 5 steps that we follow for every project, and you would have seen through the initiatives that I just walked us through. So one of the important things is to be curious. Our discovery phase has one element that is particularly unique, and that is to have an empirical measure for the behavior that we want to change. I need to challenge you, like I would challenge many of our clients. Often we're engaged to do something like increase engagement, improve the customer experience. How do we operationalize that? How do we operationalize goals like improve customer trust? We might have a powerful intuition ourselves about what that goal is, but we don't necessarily have consensus as a team in terms of how we define it and how we would measure it. How will we know if our ideas are successful if we don't have a clear calculation of exactly what is the behavior that we want to change? So we must start with a measurable, observable behavior that we will count as we employ our tactics to see what works. Second, this phase is the behavioral diagnostics phase. This is all about digging into prior literature and understanding what we know about people's biases. One of my favorite examples is Charlie Munger, the business partner of Warren Buffett, wrote this incredible essay of his observations of the biases that he could see in investors' behavior. He was able to see things like people's loss aversion, how we tend to sell our stocks when they're doing very poorly, and we tend to buy them when they're doing very, very well. He had these observations, and he came up with terms to identify them. That process of identifying the biases, have you done that yet for your customers? Do you understand, for instance, like in the case of education, the top biases that might be serving as barriers for your customers and the decisions that they're making? And I encourage you to look to all of the literature that has already been done to tackle those problems. Whether you're in insurance, you have a retail product company, there's an incredible amount of literature available for you to build your hypotheses. So this ideation phase, this is all about, don't just stay stuck in the research. Try stuff. Try out new ideas and test them through an experimentation framework. Build prototypes in the field, trying new channels out, even if it's not exactly robust. Leverage the agile development methodologies to test prototypes and test them through experimentally rigorous methods. That means launching randomized controlled trials so we can have a baseline. We can test the impact of our new ideas across different segments. And then the last part of this process is to actually build a choice architecture. This is where we now study the evidence from our experiments and we learn. We may have tested some of those conditions by really amplifying them to see what works. Maybe we take things in the organizations that are considered the sacred cows, the traditions, the old beliefs. We subject them to the scrutiny of an experiment, and now we can analyze what works and what doesn't work and learn from that. But other things that are incredibly important for an organization to do would be to document those experiments, document how they were designed, how you gathered your samples, what were your hypotheses. And then last, be ready to iterate. Be ready, like we are, to test new ideas. Now that we have that experimentation infrastructure in place, we're ready to test new things. The benefits of behavioral science are incredibly important for us to think about. I've talked about behavioral science making innovation better and faster. This first bullet point is the one that is the most meaningful to me. It's this democratization of ideas. Remember when we were voting on what's likely to increase savings? And we only had a couple people vote for coin? How many times inside our organization, maybe we were the one who came up with that idea, but because it seemed so counterintuitive, it didn't go ahead. The ideas sometimes that go ahead are the ones that might come from the authority in the room or the perceived expert in the room. You see, those are examples where using that heuristic of who's choosing what idea to implement might not be the right way. It might be the counterintuitive idea. And so here's where experimentation lets us democratize that ideation process. You don't need to be the authority. You don't need to be the expert. You don't need to be the boss in the room. Experimentation means that anyone can let their ideas be tested and subjected to scrutiny. The other thing is experimentation provides us a safe space for failure. Why? Because now we learn what didn't work, and we can understand and perhaps now have a framework to start to tweak and to optimize those things that didn't work. The third thing that's powerful about behavioral science is the fact that it lets us leverage what we already know. There's this ivory tower. It's this huge library of research on how people make decisions and what impacts and influences their behavior. I like to think about this as, there's been all of these scientists sort of working away in their labs, building all of this rich insight about human behavior. And here we are in the real world, trying to get people to save for their retirement, try out our new product. We're trying to get them to do things. So there's this huge chasm between all of this incredible intellectual property that already exist and the work that we're doing. All of these ideas waiting for us to test in the real world. The next thing is the fact that behavioral science fosters curiosity. It lets us go deeper with the questions that we have, and it lets us actually find out other nuances and lets us build a framework that we can test and retest and continue to try new ideas. And then last, it gives us this framework to ask and answer. One of the things that's sometimes really frustrating in our organizations is, some people believe this and other people believe that, and we just churn and churn. But we don't have a process by which we can actually have really solid evidence to now resolve that debate and let us move on to other questions. So in conclusion, I hope that you recognize that the power to transform society and the economy is actually within you. I very much look forward to your science. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Lots to talk about there. We've got a number of questions already coming in. Thank you for those. Just bring those up. There we go. I'm going to kick off with a couple of questions that I had, sort of thinking about that. In terms of going about implementing this culture of experimentation that you were talking about there, that can seem like a challenge for a lot of organizations. Where do I begin? You seem such a paradigm shift in terms of thinking from what a lot of organizations are currently doing. How do you sort of go about starting the process?
That's a great question. And it does require a radical shift. It requires a radical shift in thinking, and it does require a different way of working. And there's a few ways to then go about it. Do you pick maybe one of the most complex projects, one of the most strategically challenging projects, or do you sometimes maybe just pick something very simple? And it depends on the organization and the readiness and, in some ways, the level of commitment that the organization has for scientific thinking. So I hope that you were able to see, for instance, through the example with the school, that it was just emails and text. I mean, really not that big of a deal from an operational perspective, from a cost perspective. Or the other example that I gave of using the color paper, also not that big of a deal in terms of cost and operational impact. But strategically, the benefit to the organization of now seeing what happens when you move to a strategy through this process of the scientific method of having evidence. Once you build that framework, now the organizational momentum can grow quickly, and the organizational curiosity for people's desire to see what worked, to try new things, will build speed quickly. So you can actually start with very simple experiments. Now, the other example that I gave in the case of the beer, that was an expensive project. It took a ton of time. It was very, very complicated. We did 3D printing of the prototypes. There were a ton of, it was like a little army that worked on running that experiment. It's a billion-dollar problem that organization has, and it was worth the effort. So we can go both ways. We can go with running these little experiments to help increase the learning and get that kind of momentum going in the organization, or you might be in a place where it's like, we need to go for it. Let's tackle the biggest thing that's keeping us all up at night and run the scientific method against that.
Yeah. There are so many of these biases.
Yeah.
Where do you sort of know where to start? How can we start getting better at the intuition? I mean, you mentioned the literature there, but you said it yourself. There's so much. So if I'm thinking, how can I start thinking about this? Where do I begin? So I suppose the specific question is, how can we start getting better quickly in terms of our intuition? And maybe are there some kind of recommended readings or starting points for people?
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that is essential for every organization to have is of course, to have a journey map. And maybe we have that, maybe we don't, maybe we've used it, maybe we haven't. In my experience, it's been so many times where the leadership team hasn't actually been able to buy the product. Maybe to buy a mortgage just to see what that experience is like is very difficult to get that. But starting with having that journey map in place is a foundational building block, because then what we can do is start to identify where are the decision points. Just where do people have to think in order to proceed to the next step? By flagging where those decision points are, we're now on our way to understand the biases that happen within each one. And now we can turn to the literature to help us understand those biases, dig deeper in terms of what they actually mean. And here's where we can turn to public resources. And I very much want to encourage us to leverage the incredible amount of empirical research that already exists. Now, from a book perspective, I humbly suggest my co-founder and business partner's book. Dan Ariely wrote a book called Predictably Irrational, and it's one of my favorite books in terms of opening up people to what behavioral economics looks like in the real world. There's also Nobel Prize-winning Daniel Kahneman's book called Thinking Fast and Slow. I'd suggest reading those, and then a third book would be called Nudge. By working through those 3 books, you've got a fantastic foundation for understanding what behavioral economics is and examples of how it could be applied and where it's been applied.
Impartially, they're 3 great books, so I can recommend them as well. There's a couple of people asking about how the discipline of behavioral science, behavioral economics, should or could intertwine with other disciplines. So I'm looking here, I think it was Sergio asked about the relationship between that and design thinking, for example, and human-centered design. And there was another question here from Arturo, who asked about the relationship between what you were talking about and neuroscience and neuromarketing and those kind of things.
Yes.
Have you got any sort of insights around that and how complementary the sort of behavioral science can be on the one side with these other sort of disciplines?
Absolutely. BE Works is part of a collective of agencies. One of them is IDEO, and IDEO is renowned for its work in design thinking. Design thinking is a beautiful discipline, especially around building prototypes and having a mechanism for building prototypes that are responsive to consumer perspectives. If you have that methodology in-house, you already have some of the foundational elements that you need to now put behavioral insights to enrich the perspective taking and empathy that the design thinker is using to diagnose the problem. Then the behavioral research will give them new ideas of things to build and will help round out what those prototypes are. And then the third part about the interrelationship then is experimentation. Because there's a randomized control test, we'll test those prototypes in a way that lets us really determine what's working and to what degree. Now, neuroscience is a critical input to behavioral science. We see so much about understanding the mechanism of reward on people's behavior, which is fundamental to many of the strategies that we're testing. Behavioral economics is actually interdisciplinary. Our own team has cognitive psychologists who understand things like our memory, our attention, our perception. Social psychology, which is all about understanding the impact and influence of other people and our impressions of other people and what we think they think about us. And neuroscience is great for helping us understand those reward systems, but also developmental psychology is useful to understanding things like how our risk perception changes as we age. So behavioral economics then is actually an interdisciplinary science combining these together.
Got it. Excellent. It's an interesting question from Carlos. He says, sometimes experimentation might become almost a bet to confront egos within the organization. So how do you sort of ensure that experimentation is separate from sort of just a way of kind of combating personal interest within the organization? You know what I mean?
I actually think that's a fantastic quote. I actually think if it's okay, Carlos, I'd like to use that. Because thank you, Carlos. I think we need to battle egos. I think that that's one of the challenges that we face in our organizations. Speaking on behalf of introverts, speaking on behalf of maybe younger people in our organization, speaking on behalf of persons of color and other folks who don't necessarily have voice, experimentation does become a way to tackle ego. Now, how are we making sure that we're not just fighting each other? The evidence will be in what we actually test. We will see if we're getting more results or not. If we're just coming up with ideas merely to try to win, but then again, isn't that a healthy kind of competition? Having that evidence to show what works and what doesn't, isn't that a healthy kind of competition? It's structured. It allows us to fight fair, because now we're fighting through the process of what works and what evidence supports, what large egos.
Yeah, interesting. One thing, I think you touched on it somewhat in the presentation, but I didn't go into too much detail, and that's sort of the ethical implications of some of this activity. The ability to sort of preset certain situations and perhaps take advantage of people's susceptibility and people's biases in negative ways. You say it should be done in a positive way, but what is there to stop organizations and companies from taking advantage of people's biases in a negative way?
That's right. So we have to look to what policies and procedures, what kind of ethics do we already have in our company? And how well do our teams understand that? Because behavioral economics does offer an incredibly powerful tool set to influence behavior. And if we're operating in an organization that doesn't already have a culture of caring about the customer and caring about its employees, then we need to be cautious about the tests that we're running and looking to who the beneficiary is. So long as we're asking ourselves, who is the beneficiary of this strategy? When we're running our experiments, we can actually ensure that we're doing the things that are in the best interest. The other thing about running experiments, though, is that we're able to see things that we might not predict. We might see negative consequences to customers of the ideas that we think are good ideas. I'll give you a really important example. Regulators around the world have been mandating the use of disclosures for various products and services, and we see that on the internet now. The intuition by regulators is that by mandating disclosures, people's skepticism would increase, and people would be more likely to be cautious. However, we've seen the exact opposite effect in empirical research. It turns out, for instance, when a doctor might tell you, I'm recommending this other procedure to you, but this procedure that I'm recommending to you, I have a conflict of interest. I actually have a financial benefit to me with this procedure that I'm recommending. Please, I want you to make the best decision possible. The regulatory view of that story is that your skepticism ought to increase, and we ought to see fewer people getting the treatment, right? If that's how the disclosure works and being aware of the conflict of interest becomes salient, we ought to see fewer people. But in fact, we see the exact opposite effect. What happens with disclosures is that people's trust increases. In fact, the process goes, if the doctor was so honest to tell me about this conflict of interest, they most certainly have my benefit at heart. And maybe the doctor does, but in fact, that's a very opposite effect or backfiring effect that occurs from disclosure. And so, experimentation actually lets us look at unintended consequences or consequences that we might not have predicted, and lets us actually ensure that we're doing things that are ultimately in the best interest of the customers.
One final question, thank you for that. One final question before we close. As changing the focus a little bit, a couple of people here are interested about how we can sort of use behavioral economics, behavioral science internally within our organizations, how we can use it as a leadership tool. So rather than thinking about how we can understand better our consumer behavior or sort of drive innovations, how we can actually do it to improve employee performance, for example. Any thoughts around that to close?
Absolutely. Performance itself is another area. There's so many opportunities for rethinking how we're compensating our teams. Another area would be even how we're hiring. So many of these decisions, so many practices in HR have been built by gut, as opposed to actually looking to the research in terms of understanding what motivates people. We look to our gut to how we hire people without recognizing the bias in that process. Behavioral economics lets us replace gut decision-making with statistical judgment. It's about debiasing our thinking as managers by understanding the biases that we have, by developing procedures that help us overcome those biases, to use data to help us reach better decisions, and help us generate evidence that can inform our overall decision-making and strategies.
That's perfect. Okay, wonderful. Kelly Peters, thank you very much. Ladies
Thanks so
and gentlemen,
much.
Kelly Peters.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Chris.
Great, thank you.